I work on the museum collections, but a lot of my work actually is dealing with new finds. So anything that comes up under the law of treasure, so finds of precious metals, basically in my period, I'm the person who advises the courts on its legal status and whether it is treasure or not. And that often drives new research, and the volume of material that's come up in the last few years has been huge. So normally the Anglo-Saxon period, we don't tend to get very large hoards of coins, get huge hoards of Roman coins, big hoards of late medieval ones. That's one of the ways I first got involved with Tutbury, is that the largest hoard of coins ever found in Britain was found half a mile from a castle in the 1830s, and I can actually trace it going missing from the castle on a particular day in 1322. It's a great story in itself, that one, because we can trace it going missing and then being found and then largely going missing again because it was melted down and sold off in parcels to collectors. And that was one of the things that led to the laws being tightened up on treasure in the 19th century. We've then had this huge explosion with metal detecting over the last 20, 30 years. And that means the volume is huge. And I worked out that in terms of coins from my period, I've personally looked at more coins as treasure in the last 10 years than my predecessors did over 100 years previously.
And that's because people are out looking, or other reasons?
It's because people are out looking more, and it just happens that recent finds have included a few very large ones. So there's a huge hoard of from the early 11th century, King Knut's came up, spoiled my Christmas in 2014. I think it was Christmas Eve they found it. And so I had the media getting in touch and everything at home when I was trying to enjoy a Christmas holiday. There was a big one, January, sort of losing all track of time now, as you would, I think it was January last year it was, there was a big hoard turned up in Somerset, or historical Somerset, from just after the Norman Conquest. It's the biggest hoard of that period that's ever been found, and it's going to shed new light on just what happened after the Norman Conquest and how things were changing. And it also really interestingly suggests that there's a bit of history that always gets forgotten about, which is Harold gets killed at the Battle of Hastings. Everyone's heard that, and so all the books, Anglo-Saxon history stops and Norman history starts. There's actually a gap of a couple of months, just over 2 months, between Harold being killed and William being accepted and crowned as king. What was going on in that period? Well, I think I can now show, as a result, both of looking at these new finds and looking at older ones, that until things settled down, until it was actually established, yes, William is now going to be accepted, there's all sorts of people making a play for power, including Harold's sister, who just gets forgotten about. She's the last adult member of that dynasty. She's the widow of a previous king, one of the richest people in England, and yet just gets forgotten about. And so I'm trying to rehabilitate her as the forgotten last almost Queen of England. So
well, that's interesting, in and of, obviously, as a personality herself, but also when you realise if she can be forgotten at that point, there's this assumption that, you know, women just were sidelined and you know, we didn't get female monarchs for ages because, you know, it was abhorrent. But when you find out you're missing a piece where a woman was vying for the throne and was a serious contender for a throne, it adds to that. We assume a lot based on what we know, forgetting that there's a whole heap that we don't know.
Exactly, yeah. And it's one of the things that's really fascinating for my period, because we don't have all the source materials. So people working on the 16th century, like Leslie, they've got huge amounts of evidence that they can draw on. For my period, we've got some historical evidence, but with big holes in it. And it's very easy for historians to write the history of those periods as if the evidence that we do have is complete. And so you've got to consider, what are the things that we know that we know? What are the things that we know that we don't know? But also, what are the things that we don't know that we don't know? What's actually going on in the gaps? And there are things that we can sometimes see we're missing. We know that there are times that there must be a king of a particular kingdom, but we don't happen to have a record of who it is, but we assume there must be a king, although maybe it's a queen. But there are other things we don't even think that we might not be hearing about. We can only guess. But the more the new little bits of evidence come up through archaeology and metal detecting and so on, those can raise questions about the things that we didn't even realise were gaps. So a lot of my work is based around challenging what we think we already know. Another thing I've been spending a lot of time on recently, again as a result of a couple of hoards that I've been working on, is the established history that we have of Alfred the Great. And Alfred, I think, was a great king and a very successful one, but a lot of our evidence for him comes from sources written at his court. So we're getting the account of Alfred's reign and his rise to power that Alfred wanted us to get. And what we can actually see looking at the coins is that other figures have effectively been airbrushed out of history. So there's a king who's dismissed in a couple of sentences in the surviving historical records, but the coins show must actually have been an ally on equal terms with Alfred. And he's just written out. So I've drawn parallels there with Stalin airbrushing Trotsky out of the history of the Soviet Union when it no longer suited him. So we don't literally have airbrushed photos, but we have similar things. So these are the sort of things that my work revolves around, is re-examining the historical sources that we've got and looking at them afresh. What do they actually say, and how does that compare with archaeological evidence, with the evidence of the coins, and so on? So I'm sort of ranging over different disciplines.
Absolutely fascinating. So do you publish books, or is this papers, academic?
Books and papers, yeah. And then a lot of it sits there waiting for me to get time to actually publish it. But yeah, and there's a little paper published just a couple of months ago on the Alfred thing, but there's going to be a much bigger article on that when I can find time to finish it. But also because one of the hoards that I've been working on wasn't properly reported and is the subject of ongoing police inquiries, I'm not satisfied that I've got all of the evidence yet. So I don't want to go to all the trouble of finishing the article, only then to have a whole load of new evidence that might prove me wrong come out the moment it's published. So that's the challenge with dealing with the new material.
Why would people hoard? What was the purpose of hoard?
I don't think there's necessarily a single purpose that explains all of them. Very often they can be linked with political instability and fear. So it's safety. You bury your wealth in the ground because you don't have any other way of keeping it safe, and you just hope that you'll be in a position to come back and get it. There's an account that often gets quoted in discussions of hoards from Samuel Pepys's diary when the Dutch were threatening London, and he sends a message to his wife saying, "Bury the money." And he's then furious because she did this in broad daylight in the garden, so anyone could see it. And I seem to remember they couldn't actually find everything again, so some of it did go missing. And that explains how some of these hoards are probably left. And also, if whatever it is an ongoing situation over several months, then someone might think, okay, well, I won't go back, I'll leave it in the ground, so they may survive the initial crisis, and then 2 years later, they drop dead of a heart attack, never having told anyone that it's there. So there's all sorts of reasons why it's not found again. The treasure from Tutbury that I mentioned, that was buried in the context of the Civil War. The king's cousin at that point owned Tutbury. He was defeated in a battle a couple of miles from here, retreated to the castle with the king hot on his heels. Some of his men decided to hide the money, clearly. We know that they took it to the church, which is between the castle itself and where the hoard was found in the river, and that's the last that anyone heard of it until it was then found in the riverbed by workmen in 1831. So it's there. It's specifically said to have been removed from the castle because they were sure the castle would be looted. So they thought, remove it to the church for safety. Someone then clearly decided to move it on. Now, we don't know with that one, was it that someone thought, well, we haven't got time to dig a big enough hole to bury this in, let's hide it in the river because we can just roll the barrels down to the river and come back for them when it's safe, and then for whatever reason never did. Or was someone actually trying to get them away to safety in the north, crossing the river at the ford that was there at the time, and the cart collapsed that was carrying them, and maybe killing the driver of the cart in the process? Is it just accident that they ended up at that point? We don't really know. Some hoards, we think they're probably buried for religious purposes. So there are some that seem to be buried in very strange places, because they may be offerings to the gods. So particularly in wet places where there was no chance of ever realistically recovering them. That's more likely for some periods than for others. Some hoards, some of the smaller ones, might just be dropped. And if you have a purse of 100 Anglo-Saxon coins, that doesn't actually take a lot of room because they're much smaller and thinner than modern coins. So if you think of a hoard of 5p pieces rather than a hoard of pound coins, doesn't take a lot of space, and if that gets lost and trampled into the mud, you might easily never find it again.
Yeah. So there could be a lot still out there then?
Oh, there is. There's no doubt about it. One of my predecessors at the museum apparently said in the late 60s or early 70s, I think we've probably now found pretty much everything there is to find, and we're not going to get much more. But as I said, for me, 10 years equates to 100 years previously of finds. This stuff is turning up in unprecedented quantities. And because there's always publicity about these big finds, more and more people are doing it. So more and more are being found. So I don't think the numbers are going to go down anytime soon.
Is there any link to development for housing?
Yeah, I mean, most archaeology now takes place ahead of building development, whether that's housing or new roads or whatever. And there's a fascinating find of a mass burial a few years ago from around about the year 1000, where they'd all been killed because all the bodies had been thrown into a pit and all the skulls neatly piled at one side. So no doubt as to what happened there. And that was found during road building. And again, that's sort of opening new doors of knowledge and understanding. But stuff ahead of housing and commercial developments as well. So that's where a lot of proper excavation takes place, whereas most metal detecting takes place in rural areas, just because that's where they can get permission to detect on farmland at times when it's not in use. So there's always a correlation in detecting activity and ploughing time, because that's the time the farmers are most willing to let them on the soil, is between it getting ploughed and getting sown, because there's nothing to be damaged in the process. So we normally expect a couple of big spikes in the spring and the autumn.
With the house building, I know in my area they're building now on areas that were previously farm land.
Yeah.
We are edging out into the green belt now, which environmentally is questionable, but it's got to give some good finds, I'd have thought, if we're doing this sort of nationwide.
Yeah, I think that's right, because the population used to be much more dispersed across the wider agricultural landscape. The huge farms that are typical today are a relatively recent development, and there was much more dotted around population in the countryside. There's lots of little villages that have now disappeared centuries ago, so you've also got sort of rebuilding of the landscape, so large quantities of soil being moved around from one place to another as a result of road building or canal building in the 19th century and things like that. So you've got, and indeed with things like night soil being removed from towns to provide fertiliser, there's a lot of stuff that's now in fields in the countryside that probably started off in the towns.
Oh, so it's not necessarily where it originated. You're not finding
not always, yeah.
Gosh,
yeah.
So many layers to it. Go in a second, but I was just thinking while I've got you on, this Stonehenge road. So is there? I imagine the archaeologists in that project are going to be full time for a long time. Are we hoping that brings up? Must be hoping that brings up some treasures.
Although the date of Stonehenge, there's not a huge amount of treasures in that sense, because they didn't use metal so much at that period, but finds of interest, definitely. The work that's been done on Stonehenge over the last 10-20 years has moved way beyond Stonehenge itself as a monument, and they're thinking about Stonehenge within a wider archaeological landscape and a ritual landscape with all sorts of other sites and approaches considered. So although the road will be sited to avoid the monument itself, it's going to be cutting right through that wider archaeological landscape. So yeah, I'm sure they'll find things of interest. But they may also find things of interest from completely different periods. That's also a possibility, because you can often start looking for one thing and find something else. There was a lovely Viking boat burial found a few years ago by archaeologists who thought it was very likely to be a Stone Age burial mound. So that's what they went there expecting to dig up. And in fact, they were mostly Stone Age specialists themselves, and found, to their surprise, it was actually a boat burial instead from thousands of years later. So, there may be things like that dotted around Stone. Well, I doubt there'll be Vikings around Stonehenge, but you never know.
That would be interesting. That would be another challenge. Accurate understanding.
Yes, it would. I mean, it's not impossible. We know that they were active for a very short period in Wiltshire. We also know Wiltshire's a major area in the civil war between Stephen and Matilda in the mid 12th century. So, and there was lots of skirmishing across there. So maybe we'll find a lost 12th century battleground that we didn't know about. There's any number of things that could turn up in that sort of area.
It appears to do your job, any historian job, the first thing I think is to have an open mind.
Absolutely. I think there are some historians who get so locked into this is the way it is, that they just cannot take on board new evidence that challenges that. So there's a wonderful find of Anglo-Saxon gold called the Staffordshire Hoard about 10 years ago, which is found quite near where we live in Lichfield. And there were some leading Anglo-Saxon archaeologists who just said, well, it can't possibly have been found there. It must be a find from East Anglia that for some reason people are pretending to have found in Staffordshire, because it couldn't possibly be found from anywhere other than East Anglia, because that would mean our books were wrong. And that couldn't be the case. And of course it was found in Staffordshire, there's no doubt about it.
I just get me coat, sorry.
Well, what they could have done is rewritten their books, added a chapter, and resold their books. That was a bit short-sighted of them.
Indeed, and that's what's now happening, and everyone in the field is reinterpreting the history and archaeology of that period, including those who said this cannot possibly be the case. Now the evidence is clear and irrefutable. They're taking it on board, but that initial reaction was really interesting, slightly disturbing.